Enslaved for much of his childhood, one man was able to escape the tragedy of American slavery and triumph as a leader in the Underground Railroad and abolishment of slavery. His name was Josiah Henson. As a child in Charles County, Maryland, Josiah Henson was born on June 15, 1789. His parents were slaves, and he was born into this life. When he was young, at the age of 3, he saw his father being punished for standing up to a slave owner, only to be lashed 100 times for disobeying. As he grew, his former master died. Therefore, his entire family was then sold away out of the plantation where they lived and was never to see them again. Josiah was neglected in his childhood under his new master, and he eventually was sold to the Riley family in Alabama, where his mother lived. Josiah quoted in his own words about his childhood, "This is one of my earliest observations of men, an experience which has been common to me with thousands of race, the bitterness of which its frequency cannot diminish to any individual who suffers it." Josiah eventually became one of the Riley family's most trusted enslaved workers. He continued to grow and was ultimately entrusted as the supervisor of the master's farm in Montgomery County, Maryland. He continued to age, married his wife Nancy, and had 4 children. He started saving money so that he could someday buy his own freedom from his master, Isaac Riley. In September 1928, Josiah Henson tried to buy his own freedom by giving his master $300 and a promised note of $100. Riley, though, double-crossed Josiah and added an extra zero to the promised note, making it $1,000. Riley cheated him, Mr. Henson, of his own savings and threatened to sell him. As Josiah once again quoted in his own words about this experience, full of gloomy reflections on my loneliness and the poverty-stricken aspect of the whole farm, I sat down thinking how I could escape from the accursed spot. Feeling cheated, Henson returned to Kentucky. He decided then to flee with his wife and children and escape to Kern County, Upper Canada, in 1830. He triumphed and was able to cross safely into Upper Canada by the Niagara River in New York. He brought his wife and 4 children. Upper Canada had become a refuge for slaves from the United States after 1793. Any slave who set foot in Canada would eventually be free. In Canada, he worked in Erie, and through contracts and financial assistance, he was able to purchase 200 acres in Dawn Township. At Dawn, he formally established the Dawn Settlement. This was a settlement and laborers' school for other fugitive slaves from the United States. His settlement offered other former slaves who have escaped from the U.S. a chance to start a new life. The slaves would all start a new life in Upper Canada, free from the tragedies and brutalities of American slavery. This was a Dawn settlement in Dresden, Ontario. This settlement grew to include mills and a brickyard. At its peak, about 500 people lived in the Dawn settlement. Josiah's goal for the settlement was to employ and educate former slaves and develop the British American Institute, an industrial school. After his escape and starting the Dawn settlement, he also became involved at this time with the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was in defiance of the Fugitive Slave Acts of America. It was a network of secret routes and safe houses in the northern United States during the early to mid-19th century. It was used by the African American slaves to escape into the Free States and into Canada. The free individuals who helped runaway slaves travel toward freedom were called conductors. The fugitive slaves were known as cargo. This was a dangerous path to freedom. The slaves had a long, torturous journey. This included hiding when in sight of slave masters. The safe houses used as hiding places in the slavery states along the Underground Railroad were called stations. A plaque in Erie County describes this event. Many homes in Sandusky and other parts of Erie County were stations on the Underground Railroad. Before and during the Civil War, residents provided food, shelter, clothing, and transportation to Canada. Harriet Beecher Stowe used Sandusky as a gate to freedom for the runaway slaves in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Josiah Henson became an active member of this effort. He was a Methodist preacher who spoke as an abolitionist on routes between Tennessee and Ontario. He helped over 200 slaves escape into Canada and gain their freedom. Josiah then shared his story of tragedy and triumph by narrating an autobiography to Mr. Eliot. His story was published as a book in 1849. This book was called The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself, is a slave narrative written by Josiah Henson. This book would later become famous for being the basis of the title character from Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. In these books, Henson recalls his childhood, forced separation from his wife and children, escape to Canada, role as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and meeting with Queen Victoria in England. This slave narrative grew in popularity, and Miss Harriet Beecher Stowe was inspired and decided to use his story as the basis of an anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Published in 1852, Beecher's novel had a huge effect on the attitudes toward African American slavery in the United States. It became a best-selling book that helped to move the anti-slavery movement and was even recognized by the American president. President Abraham Lincoln credited the book with provoking the Civil War by helping to lay down the groundwork. There was a lot of contributing factors for the Civil War, such as conflicts between the North and South. Harriet Beecher's book, influenced by Josiah Henson's life, placed a face on slavery and turned it into something people could understand and relate to. Ultimately, the Civil War was a war claimed to be due to the differences between the free and slave states over the power of the government to prohibit slavery. In conclusion, Josiah Henson was an American laborer and clergyman who escaped the tragedy of the brutal bonds of slavery and triumphed by establishing a settlement for the fugitive slaves. He helped hundreds of slaves gain their independence and education. Josiah Henson lived the remaining part of his life in Dresden, Ontario. Josiah Henson's influential life eventually ended at the age of 93 in Dresden, Ontario on May 5, 1883. The end.